What if the Vikings did not conquer the oceans by strength at all? What if their greatest weapon was not iron or muscle or fear, but something unseen and often misunderstood? For centuries, we have pictured Viking ships as brutal machines driven by endless rowing and raw force. Long, dark silhouettes tearing through waves, men bent forward in pain. An ocean, supposedly beaten into submission by will alone. That image feels powerful, but it is wrong. The North Atlantic does not yield to force. It never has, and it never will. Tonight, we begin with a question that continues to unsettle modern engineers and historians, because it challenges everything we assume about ancient technology and human dominance. How did fragile wooden ships with no engines and no modern navigation cross some of the most violent waters on Earth again and again, not once by luck, but repeatedly, and return? The answer is not speed. It is not courage. It is not strength. It is wind, and more importantly, the rare ability to understand it rather than fight it. The North Atlantic is not a passive sea. It is a moving landscape that never rests and never forgives mistakes. Cold currents slide silently beneath warmer ones. Winds reverse direction without warning. Storms rise faster than human reflex or preparation, turning calm water into chaos within minutes. Across history, any culture that tried to dominate this environment through force alone vanished quickly. Their ships splintered, their sails torn apart, their crews erased without names or records, leaving only scattered remains on distant shores. The Vikings survived because they did not wage war against the ocean. They observed it, measured it through experience, and learned its patterns with patience rather than defiance. Their ships were never designed to overpower waves or stand rigid against impact. They were designed to move with motion itself, to bend when pressure increased, to yield when necessary, and to recover instantly when the sea released its grip. This philosophy reached far beyond the shape of the hull. It lived in the sail itself. Where other cultures treated sails as simple cloth meant to catch wind, the Vikings treated wind as a partner, something to guide, negotiate with, and respect rather than command. A Viking sail was never decoration. It was a precision instrument shaped by generations of trial, failure, and hard-earned survival at sea. Woven from wool rather than linen, it was dense enough to hold its form under pressure, yet flexible enough to breathe and respond to changing air, behaving less like fabric and more like a living surface. Lanolin remained trapped within the fibers, creating natural water resistance long before chemical treatments existed, while salt from repeated voyages gradually stiffened the weave, refining its performance rather than degrading it. Even the seams were placed with intention, angled to control how air flowed across the sail instead of tearing against it. This was not accidental craftsmanship or tradition without thought. It was applied physics developed through experience rather than equations. When wind pressed against the sail, it did not collapse or snap. It curved smoothly, redirecting force downward and forward, transforming raw pressure into controlled motion. The sail did not simply catch wind, it sculpted it. Modern wind tunnel tests now confirm what Viking sailors already understood instinctively. Their sails generated lift in multiple directions, allowing steady progress even when the wind refused to blow from behind. Navigation without instruments feels impossible to the modern mind, shaped by screens, coordinates, and constant confirmation. Yet Viking sailors did not depend on certainty in the way we understand it. They relied on patterns learned slowly, repeated across seasons and voyages, until the ocean itself became readable. Wind direction was interpreted through the behavior of waves, the texture and height of clouds, the movement of birds that never strayed far from land, and even faint smells carried across water from distant shores. Nothing was singular evidence, everything was weighed together. The sail itself became a sensor, alive to the slightest change, where subtle shifts in tension revealed invisible changes in air pressure long before they could be felt on skin. Crews adjusted constantly, not with dramatic gestures or sudden commands, but through continuous micro-corrections that kept the ship balanced within the flow. This is why Viking ships appear calm in sagas and in archaeology alike, because panic wasted energy, and wasted energy meant death. Efficiency was survival. They were not guessing where the wind might go next. They were listening carefully to where it already was. The sail cannot be separated from the hull beneath it, because a Viking ship was never a collection of parts. It was a single living system shaped to move as one. Light enough to rise with waves rather than punch through them, the hull flexed and responded to the sea, absorbing motion instead of resisting it, strong not through stiffness but through balance. When wind pressure increased, the ship answered by changing posture rather than fighting back. The hull distributed stress across its length, the mast bent slightly under load, and the sail reshaped itself in response, each element adjusting to protect the others. This was not weakness, and it was not rigidity. It was controlled softness, a deliberate design choice that allowed survival in conditions that destroyed more rigid vessels. Modern engineers now describe this behavior as dynamic load distribution, a principle still used in advanced structures and aircraft. The Vikings never needed a name for it. They simply called it sailing. Every component existed to protect the whole system, and no single part was ever expected to resist nature alone. Rowing was never the engine of Viking expansion. It was the last option, the reserve strength held back for moments when wind failed or precision was required. Rowing consumed calories at a brutal rate, limited distance, and exhausted crews long before storms even appeared on the horizon, turning human bodies into the weakest part of the system. Wind offered something far more valuable than speed. It offered endurance. It offered silence across open water. It offered reach beyond the limits of muscle and bone. By mastering sail control, the Vikings transformed the scale of travel itself, turning journeys measured in weeks into voyages that lasted months, converting coastlines into navigable highways and oceans into corridors rather than barriers. Their ships did not rush across the sea. They persisted upon it. This is why Viking presence seems to appear suddenly on distant shores, not because they moved faster than others, but because they could remain at sea longer than anyone else could endure, arriving where others never reached. The sea delivered harsh lessons, and the Vikings listened without denial or excuse, because ignoring failure in that environment meant never returning. Ships that failed were not dismissed as bad luck or divine punishment. They were examined carefully, their weaknesses remembered, and their lessons carried forward. Sails were rewoven with subtle changes, hull lines were adjusted by small degrees, mast placement was refined until balance improved, each modification shaped by experience rather than theory. Nothing was wasted, not even loss. Knowledge traveled orally from crew to crew, from father to son, from one settlement to the next, forming a distributed intelligence system that evolved faster than written manuals ever could. Each voyage fed the next. Each mistake sharpened future judgment, and each loss reshaped the philosophy of design and navigation. In this world, adaptation was never optional or heroic. It was simply the price of returning home alive. Popular culture clings to the image of Vikings, overpowering nature through violence and sheer will, shouting into storms and forcing the sea to yield. Reality tells a far quieter and far more disciplined story. They survive not through aggression but through restraint, awareness, and the hard-earned judgment to know when not to push forward. They understood that the ocean punished arrogance without hesitation, and that strength used blindly became a liability rather than an advantage. Raw power alone would have destroyed them. Control kept them alive. This is why Viking technology continues to unsettle modern assumptions, even centuries later, because it challenges the belief that progress always belongs to the loudest or strongest civilization. Their success reveals a different truth, that advancement often belongs to those who observe carefully, adapt patiently, and listen more closely than their rivals. The wind that once filled Viking sails is the same wind moving across the oceans today, unchanged in its nature and unimpressed by the passage of time or human ambition. It still shifts without warning, still rewards attention, and still punishes those who assume it can be controlled. Modern ships, despite their engines and instruments, continue to rely on principles first explored through wool and wood, where airflow is shaped rather than forced, and balance matters more than power. Aerodynamics has been refined, measured, and calculated, but it has not been reinvented. The Vikings never conquered the wind because conquest was never possible. They aligned themselves with it, learned its habits, and adjusted their designs and decisions accordingly. By doing so, they crossed distances that reshaped human history, linking distant shores and cultures not through dominance or violence, but through understanding, patience, and respect for forces greater than themselves. As this story closes, we are left with a simple realization that grows heavier the longer it lingers. The greatest technologies are not always machines built from metal and fuel. Sometimes they are ways of thinking shaped by humility and attention. The Vikings endured not because they mastered nature, but because they respected forces far larger than themselves, because they chose adaptation over resistance and understanding over defiance. That choice carried them farther than strength ever could. If this story echoes something from your own family history, a memory of migration, of survival, of learning how to live with land or sea rather than against it, you are invited to share that memory here. History survives not through monuments alone, but through lived experience passed quietly forward. If this film moved you, a quiet like, a thoughtful subscription, or a single comment are not clicks, they are acts of preservation. And the emotional truth that remains is this: the wind never belonged to the Vikings, but they understood it well enough to let it carry them farther than fear ever could.